It was on one of those mild amber-tinted evenings in early autumn when St. Mary Mead seemed to glow with a deceptive peace. The hedgerows were heavy with berries, the air faintly fragrant with late roses, and smoke rose lazily from cottage chimneys as the villagers settled into their evening routines. The clock of St. Luke's Church struck 6, the chime carrying gently over the village green, and just as it did, the first of many curious events began with an invitation. The invitations themselves were handwritten, on fine ivory paper, embossed with the faint scent of violets. Each bore the same short message, penned in an elegant but unfamiliar hand. You are cordially invited to dinner at the old rectory, Thursday next at 7 o'clock. A small gathering to celebrate the return of Mr. Henry Langford to St. Mary Mead. No signature, no postscript, just the place, the time, and the name that set half the village murmuring before sunset. Henry Langford. It had been 20 years since anyone had spoken his name aloud without a whisper following it. The Langfords had once been among the most respected families in the county, until Henry's sudden departure after what was delicately referred to as that unfortunate business with the will. Rumors had swirled at the time, forged documents, a bitter quarrel with his elder brother Charles, and the mysterious death of their father only weeks later. The matter was hushed up, of course. Henry left the country and life as it does went on. But St. Mary Mead had a long memory. Now he had returned. Miss Jane Marple received her invitation precisely at 6:30, hand-delivered by young Tommy Briggs, who had cycled up from the village post office. She took it from him with her usual mild smile. "Why, how very curious," she murmured, adjusting her spectacles as she read the graceful script. "The old rectory, you say?" "That's been empty since poor Mrs. Dacres moved to Bath." Tommy, who had no interest in the doings of the elderly, shrugged. "Mr. Langford's taken it for a bit, ma'am. Fixed up right nice, they say. Got a motor car and all." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, more to herself than to the boy. How industrious of him. That night, over her solitary supper of cold beef and pickles, she pondered the matter. It wasn't every day that a man with such a past returned to a place like St. Mary Mead, and with such pomp as a dinner party. It smacked of something deliberate. People, she reflected, rarely revisited their old homes unless they sought either peace or revenge. Thursday arrived with an air of faint anticipation. The talk at the grocer's was all of who might be attending. Mrs. Bantry, who prided herself on knowing everything before it became common knowledge, told the vicar's wife that Henry Langford had made his fortune in South Africa and was as charming as ever, if one liked that sort of charm. By 7 o'clock, the old rectory was alight with lamps and laughter. Miss Marple, wearing her best lace shawl and a small silver brooch shaped like a thistle, arrived precisely on time. The gravel crunched softly beneath her sensible shoes as she was shown inside by a young maid with anxious eyes. The guests numbered 8 in all. Besides Miss Marple, there was Colonel Melrose, stout and red-faced, always eager for a tale of scandal. Mrs. Bantry, fluttering with excitement and curiosity. Dr. Leonard Hay, a calm man with keen grey eyes who had attended most of the village for years. Miss Lydia Cresswell, a tall, elegant woman in her 40s, once Henry Langford's fiancée. Although that had been long ago, Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard, newcomers to St. Mary Mead, pleasant, slightly nervous people who had bought the mill house. And, of course, Henry Langford himself. He stood near the fire, perfectly composed, his once boyish charm mellowed by time. His hair was silver now, his smile practiced and assured. When Miss Marple entered, he greeted her warmly, almost too warmly, she thought. "Miss Marple, how delightful. I remember you as my mother's dearest friend." "You haven't changed a bit." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "I dare say I have, Mr. Langford. Time is a most efficient sculptor." Dinner was served promptly, a beautifully laid table, gleaming silver, and conversation that hummed politely over the clink of glasses. The meal itself was remarkable only for its perfection. Cream of mushroom soup, roast duck with orange, and a trifle that Mrs. Bantry declared divine. Yet beneath the surface of civility, small tensions flickered like candlelight in a draught. Miss Lydia Cresswell, for one, appeared uncharacteristically pale. Once or twice she glanced at Henry with a look that might have been longing or loathing. Colonel Melrose, meanwhile, asked questions about South Africa. that Henry answered with an ease too smooth to be entirely convincing. And Dr. Hay's cool, appraising gaze lingered on Henry's right hand, which trembled ever so slightly when lifting his glass. It was only Miss Marple who noticed that the maid, the same nervous young woman who had opened the door, seemed almost frightened of her employer. Each time she entered the room, she avoided Henry's eyes, her hands trembling as she poured the wine. As the clock struck 9, Henry rose, glass in hand. "My friends," he said, "I must thank you all for coming. This evening marks not merely my return to St. Mary Mead, but the beginning of a new chapter. The past, as they say, is dead and buried." At that moment there came a soft crash from the doorway. The maid had dropped a decanter. Red wine spread like blood across the carpet. She stared at it as though transfixed. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered. Henry's expression darkened for the briefest instant, then smoothed into charm again. "Think nothing of it, my dear. Accidents happen." But Miss Marple saw the flicker of fear in the girl's eyes as she retreated. Later, when coffee was served in the drawing room, the storm broke. Henry Langford had just begun to recount some tale of his travels when he faltered mid-sentence, a strange look passing over his face. His glass fell, shattering on the hearth within seconds. He slumped forward, striking the arm of his chair. Mrs. Bantry screamed. Dr. Hay rushed to his side, checked his pulse and looked up grimly. "He's dead," the doctor said quietly. "Poisoned." A stunned silence followed. Somewhere in the hall the maid began to sob. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting untouched in her lap. Her pale blue eyes, calm and penetrating, moved slowly around the room, taking in the faces, the gestures, the subtle reactions of shock and guilt and fear. She sighed softly. "Oh dear," she murmured. It seems dinner was rather more final than any of us expected. The shock of Henry Langford's sudden death lingered long after the guests had dispersed from the old rectory. Though Dr. Hay had insisted that no one should leave until the police arrived, the night itself seemed to resist order. An unsettling hush had fallen over St. Mary Mead, broken only by the distant tolling of the church bell. By the following morning, the whole village was humming with speculation. At the post office, Mrs. Bantry was already recounting her version of events to a rapt audience, embellishing it with each retelling. He was halfway through a perfectly harmless story about lions, of all things, when he simply went green. Positively green, I tell you. Dropped like a stone. And that poor maid, she went white as chalk. "Poison, they say," murmured Mrs. Archer, the grocer's wife, with a kind of dreadful satisfaction. Dr. Hay himself said so, though how anyone could get poison into a gentleman's drink without him noticing, I can't imagine. Miss Marple, who happened to be standing by the biscuit shelf, appeared mildly absorbed in choosing between digestive and shortbread. "Oh, one imagines it isn't so difficult," she said gently. "People rarely pay attention to what is placed before them when they feel at ease. There's something rather vulnerable about good hospitality, don't you think?" Mrs. Bantry turned sharply. "You mean one of the guests?" Miss Marple gave a small, vague smile. "Oh, I wouldn't presume to say. But it does strike me as curious that Mr. Langford should have chosen to celebrate his return with people he hadn't seen in 20 years. I wonder why he invited that particular company. That question, as it turned out, would occupy the entire village for days. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham by mid-morning. A competent, plain-spoken man who knew Miss Marple well enough to treat her with wary respect. Together they stood in the drawing-room of the old rectory, now eerily still. The decanter of wine, the overturned glass, the untouched coffee tray, all remained as they had been left. "Cyanide," Craddock said grimly. Dr. Hay confirmed it. Someone slipped it into his drink between courses, likely the coffee. "He didn't suffer long, poor devil." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the faint crimson stain where the decanter had fallen the night before. The maid seemed frightened of her master. "Did you speak with her?" "She's at the station now. Seems she'd only been employed a fortnight. Swears she never touched the food or drink, only served it." Craddock frowned. "Says Mr. Langford had strange visitors after dark these past few nights. One in particular, a woman." Miss Marple's expression softened in thought. "Ah, how very interesting. A woman." She turned toward the mantelpiece, where a row of photographs had been neatly arranged, pictures of faraway places, dusty deserts, gold mines, a bustling port. Yet one stood out, a small faded photograph of two young men beside a garden gate. Henry Langford and his brother Charles. She touched the frame lightly. It's odd, isn't it, Inspector? The dead so often keep reminders of those who wronged them, or perhaps those they wronged themselves. By that afternoon, St. Mary Mead was a ferment of rumour. Miss Lydia Cresswell had taken to her bed with what her companion called nerves, though Dr. Hay quietly remarked that her pulse was quite steady for someone so distressed. Colonel Melrose had already been interviewed twice, protesting indignantly that he'd drunk from the same decanter as everyone else. And Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard, those shy newcomers, looked more harried by gossip than guilt. Miss Marple made her customary afternoon visit to Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, where tea was being poured amid breathless conjecture. "I'll wager it's about the will," Mrs. Bantry declared, eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. "Old Mr. Langford left most of the estate to Charles, didn't he? Perhaps Henry came back to reclaim it, and someone decided he shouldn't." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Yes, quite possible, though one must remember, revenge rarely comes from those who gained the most. More often it is from those who lost something they feel was rightfully theirs." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "But who would that be?" "I think," Miss Marple said mildly, "it might be rather revealing to know who prepared the coffee last night. These things are often quite ordinary, when all's said and done." Later that evening she visited Dr. Hay under the pretext of returning a misplaced handkerchief. The doctor, grave and precise, received her kindly. "You've been thinking about it, I can tell," he said. "I have," she admitted. "You see, the maid's fear wasn't that of guilt. It was of anticipation, as if she expected something dreadful to happen and didn't dare interfere. And that photograph of the two brothers, such a peculiar choice for a man celebrating his return." Dr. Hay nodded slowly. "You suspect he knew he was in danger?" "Possibly," Miss Marple murmured, "or that he had invited danger to dinner." She left soon after, walking home through the mist-shrouded lane. The night smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. Lights glowed faintly in cottage windows, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing at all. She thought of Henry Langford's final toast, "The past is dead and buried." People so rarely mean what they say, she reflected. The past has a dreadful way of digging itself up. As she reached her gate, she paused. Across the road, near the shadowed hedge, stood a figure, a woman in a dark cloak, watching the lane. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she recognized the outline. Then the woman turned swiftly away and vanished into the fog. The old lady lingered a moment longer, her breath forming soft clouds in the chill air. "Curious," she murmured to herself. "Most curious indeed. If I am not mistaken, that was Miss Cresswell, and she has no business being out of bed at this hour." Inside her cottage, Miss Marple lit her lamp and settled by the fire with her knitting. The rhythmic click of needles filled the silence. Somewhere between stitches, a pattern began to form in her mind, not of wool, but of motives and fears and quiet, fatal intentions. "Poison," she said softly, "is such an intimate choice. It requires proximity and patience. Someone who knew precisely how much to give and precisely when." Her eyes flicked toward the window, where the fog pressed softly against the glass, as if listening. "Yes," she whispered. "It wasn't revenge at all. It was something far more personal." And with that, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her expression serene but her mind quietly alight, waiting for the final piece to fall into place. The morning after Miss Marple's late-night encounter in the lane dawned cold and colourless, a faint mist hanging over the thatched roofs of St. Mary Mead. The villagers had begun to settle into their new routine of uneasy speculation, though beneath the chatter, something taut lingered in the air, a shared sense that the matter of Henry Langford's death was far from over. Inspector Craddock had returned early to the old rectory, where he was met by a subdued silence and the faint smell of stale smoke. The maid, Alice Turner, had been released after questioning, though she was to remain in the village until the investigation concluded. Miss Marple, who appeared soon after with the polite excuse of bringing scones for the inspector's breakfast, was permitted to observe quietly from the drawing room as he reviewed the evidence. "It's the coffee, beyond any doubt," Craddock said, glancing toward the polished silver service. Dr. Hay confirmed traces of cyanide in the dregs of Mr. Langford's cup. "Odd thing is, every other cup on that tray was clean." Miss Marple's eyes flicked over the cups. "You mean only his?" "Exactly. The maid claims she poured them all together, one after another. Says she can't explain how only one was poisoned. Unless she's lying. Miss Marple frowned slightly. But lying requires purpose, Inspector. Alice Turner seems a timid creature, and timidity rarely invents stories. It merely omits them. She may have seen something she's afraid to recall. Craddock gave her a small, wry smile. You've a way of putting things, Miss Marple. But what about this Miss Cresswell? She's the one who slipped out in the night, isn't she? My constable swears he saw her near the vicarage at 11. I rather thought as much, Miss Marple murmured. I happened to glimpse her myself. She looked, how shall I say, relieved rather than frightened. That suggests she was not running from guilt, but perhaps toward resolution. The inspector arched a brow. Resolution of what sort? That I do not yet know, she said gently. But I wonder if it might be connected to her engagement to Mr. Langford all those years ago. People seldom bury their hearts as neatly as they bury their dead. Craddock sighed, making a note in his book. I'll have another word with her. She's staying at the Green Man Hotel, isn't she? By mid-afternoon the fog had burned away, and Miss Marple, having quite by chance taken a walk toward the Green Man, found Lydia Cresswell seated by the window of the tea-room. She was dressed impeccably, though her face bore the drawn, strained expression of someone who has spent too many nights alone with her thoughts. Miss Marple, she said faintly, gesturing to the opposite chair, you must think it dreadful of me to be seen in public after all that's happened. Not dreadful at all, Miss Marple replied kindly. We must all eat, my dear, even in times of tragedy. It's only sensible. She added her tea with quiet grace before continuing. It must have been rather a shock seeing Mr. Langford again after so many years. Lydia's eyes flickered. Shock is too mild a word. I thought I had put it all behind me. But when his invitation came, I felt compelled to go. Foolish, really. Not foolish, Miss Marple said softly. Human. We are all drawn in one way or another to unfinished business. Lydia hesitated, then looked down. He wasn't the man I remembered. There was something hard in him. When he spoke, it was as if he wanted us to know he'd triumphed somehow, as if returning here was part of his victory. Victory over whom? Lydia's hands trembled slightly as she set her cup down. Perhaps over everyone. Charles most of all. You see, Charles Langford died last winter, alone, penniless. Henry didn't even send a letter. But they say he kept one thing of Charles's, their father's signet ring. It was on Henry's finger that night. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, though her eyes sharpened. A ring, she repeated quietly. Yes, I remember noticing it. A heavy gold one with a crest. Odd, though. It seemed a size too small. He fiddled with it throughout dinner. Lydia's gaze lifted sharply. Yes, he told me once that it didn't fit, but he wore it anyway. Said he liked the reminder of what he'd taken. When Miss Marple returned home, the details arranged themselves in her mind with quiet precision. Henry Langford, triumphant and smug, wearing a ring that did not belong to him. A maid terrified not of guilt but of expectation. A woman wandering the lanes at night seeking closure. And poison, so quick, so deliberate, that had found only its intended victim. As she settled by the fire, she recalled Dr. Hayes' remark about the maid's statement, that someone had been visiting the house before the dinner. A woman. Could that visitor have been Lydia Cresswell, or someone else entirely? There was one thing she could test immediately. She rose, went to her writing desk, and took out a small envelope addressed to Inspector Craddock. Inside she placed a note. A suggestion, if I may, have the ring on Mr. Langford's hand examined carefully. There is more than gold to its weight. The next morning brought swift results. The ring, when pried open by the inspector, revealed a tiny hollow compartment beneath the crest, containing faint crystalline residue. Cyanide, Craddock said grimly, hidden inside. Clever devil must have carried it himself, but how did it get into his coffee? Miss Marple smiled gently when he came to tell her. Oh, I rather think Mr. Langford administered it to himself, though not by intention. Craddock stared. You mean it was an accident? An accident of arrogance, perhaps, she said. He wore the ring constantly, and I suspect it had been used before, maybe to conceal the poison he once intended for someone else. When he raised his cup, the warmth of the coffee must have melted the thin lining, releasing the powder into the drink, poetic in a dreadful sort of way. The inspector was silent for a moment. And the maid? She knew, Miss Marple said quietly, or at least suspected. She saw him tampering with the ring before dinner and feared the worst but didn't dare speak. Poor child. She must have believed she'd witnessed a murder, never realizing it was merely the final stroke of a man's long-buried sin. As Craddock left, she returned to her knitting, her fingers moving deftly as her thoughts settled into calm order. The pattern was complete now, the colors aligned, the threads secure, and somewhere in the quiet rhythm of her work, Miss Marple's faint smile returned. For in St. Mary Mead, death might come suddenly, but truth, like her knitting, was always patient, though Inspector Craddock considered the case largely settled after Miss Marple's quiet explanation. She herself remained uneasy. The tidy logic of Henry Langford's accidental death satisfied the law, perhaps, but not her sense of human truth. Accidents, in her experience, rarely occurred among people so steeped in malice and secrets. Something in the scene refused to sit comfortably in her mind, like a loose stitch in an otherwise perfect pattern. That evening, as dusk draped itself over St. Mary Mead, she sat by her fire once more, the rhythmic clack of her needles keeping time with her thoughts. Her small sitting room glowed warmly, the faint ticking of the mantel clock filling the quiet. Outside, the lane was still, save for the occasional passing cart. She had almost begun to doze when a light tapping sounded at her door. It was Alice Turner, the maid. She looked pale and exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, hands twisting in her apron. "I'm sorry to come, Mum," she whispered, "but I couldn't rest. I heard what they said, that Mr. Langford poisoned himself by mistake. But it ain't right, ma'am. There's something else." Miss Marple motioned her gently inside and poured her tea. There, my dear. Start from the beginning. What troubles you?" Alice took a trembling breath. "The ring, ma'am." "The one they say killed him. It weren't on his finger when I cleared the coffee." "I swear it. He'd taken it off and put it on the mantel by the clock. I saw it there plain as day." Miss Marple set her cup down very softly. "Are you quite sure, child?" "Certain. I'd have no reason to lie. And when I came back with the tray for the coffee, it was gone. I thought maybe he'd put it back on, but when he fell, it was there again." On his hand. A silence hung between them. Miss Marple's eyes glinted faintly in the firelight. "You've done quite right to come to me, Alice. You mustn't mention this to anyone else for the moment. Not yet." When the girl had gone, Miss Marple remained motionless for several minutes, her gaze fixed on the flames. So someone had moved the ring, someone who'd known precisely what it contained, and wanted it to appear that Henry's death had been self-inflicted. The conclusion that had seemed so neat was now clouded by something darker. The next morning she visited Inspector Craddock again, arriving with her usual air of polite purpose. "I'm afraid," she began delicately, "that we may have been a touch too hasty in closing the matter. There's been a development regarding that ring." Craddock, already familiar with her tone of quiet insistence, leaned back warily. "Go on." She recounted the maid's statement. When she finished, he frowned deeply. "That means someone handled the ring after the dinner, someone still in the room." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "And that someone replaced it on Mr. Langford's finger, ensuring the poison would be blamed upon his own folly." Craddock rubbed his chin. But who would benefit from that? The man had no living relatives except the dead brother, and his fortune was his own. Fortune, Miss Marple mused, is rarely confined to coins and property. There are other inheritances, emotional, moral, even vengeful. People kill for reasons quite apart from wealth, you know. Pride, shame, humiliation. Her eyes drifted to the window, where a grey drizzle streaked the glass. "I should like to see Miss Creswell again, if you don't mind. And the doctor, too," the inspector obliged. That afternoon, both Lydia Creswell and Dr. Hay were invited to the rectory under the pretense of finalizing statements. Miss Marple sat quietly by the hearth, her knitting in her lap as they arrived. Lydia, composed but wary, avoided Dr. Hay's gaze. The doctor, in turn, seemed unusually tense. "I've asked you both here," Craddock said briskly, "because there's a small matter concerning Mr. Langford's ring. It seems its position was altered the night of his death." Dr. Hay's head turned sharply. "Altered? How so?" Before the inspector could reply, Miss Marple spoke, her tone calm and unassuming. "It appears the ring was not on Mr. Langford's hand when he began his coffee. It was replaced there later. I thought perhaps one of you might have noticed such a thing." Neither spoke. Lydia's knuckles whitened around her gloves. Dr. Hay's mouth tightened. a faint muscle jumping in his jaw. The silence stretched until Lydia let out a soft, trembling breath. "I didn't touch it," she said at last, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't, but I knew what it was." Craddock straightened. "You knew?" "Yes." She looked from one face to the other, despair flickering in her eyes. "Henry once told me about it years ago. He said he kept a little poison in that ring in case life ever became inconvenient." He laughed when he said it. He liked having control even over death. I didn't believe him then, but when I saw it again that night I knew. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And did you tell anyone?" "I meant to warn him," Lydia whispered. "After dinner when we were alone. But before I could, Dr. Hay came to speak with him." All eyes turned to the doctor. For a moment he looked as though he might deny it, but then something in him seemed to collapse. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "I did. He sent for me before the guests left. Said he wasn't feeling well. I saw the ring on the mantel, and I knew what it contained. I'd treated a man once who'd used a similar device in the colonies. I told him it was dangerous, that even a trace could kill him. He laughed in my face." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And then?" "I put it back," Dr. Hay said quietly. "I thought he'd listen. I thought he'd remove it in the morning. I never imagined—" His voice faltered. "But it must have broken when he lifted his cup. God help me, I never meant to kill him." There was a long silence. Rain pattered against the windows, soft and persistent. At last Miss Marple nodded. "No, I believe you didn't. But I think you knew deep down that he wouldn't heed your warning. Some men prefer their own destruction, if it means the last word belongs to them." Craddock exhaled heavily, shutting his notebook. "It seems this case was darker than I thought. Not quite murder, not quite accident, just human folly polished to a fatal shine." When the others had gone, Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her eyes thoughtful. The truth, as always, had surfaced, not through evidence, but through the quiet inevitability of human nature revealing itself. Later, as she walked home through the damp lanes, she thought of Henry Langford and the peculiar justice of his end. He had built his life on deceit and arrogance, and in the end, it was his own cunning that undid him, helped along by a few small acts of fear, pride, and silence. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself as the lamps of her cottage came into view. "Evil," she reflected, "seldom arrives with thunder. More often it comes quietly to dinner, wearing a courteous smile." The following morning dawned misty and pale, with a thin veil of fog drifting over the lawns of Little Briar House. The roses that had looked so charming under the lanterns last night now seemed ghostly, their petals heavy with dew. Miss Marple arrived quietly, escorted by Inspector Crail, whose brisk steps betrayed his growing impatience. He had already spent the better part of the night interviewing guests and servants, yet not a single clear lead had emerged. Lady Marchmont's death remained a mystery wrapped in civility and confusion. Inside the breakfast room, the tension was almost tangible. Mr. Pembroke sat near the window, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his tea, while Mrs. Beatrice Grey kept dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Lionel Marchmont, the grieving widower, stood stiffly by the hearth, staring into the unlit fireplace as though its cold emptiness mirrored his own. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, took a modest seat near the door. She folded her gloved hands in her lap, her blue eyes moving gently from face to face, as though observing nothing in particular, and yet missing nothing at all. Inspector Crail cleared his throat. "I'll be frank, ladies and gentlemen. The evidence is perplexing. The autopsy will confirm whether it was poison, but the symptoms suggest something administered, not long before dinner. Whoever gave it to her must have had access to her food or drink." A low murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Pembroke, thin and sharp-eyed, raised her chin. "If it was poison, Inspector, surely the cook must be questioned first. She was the one who prepared every dish." Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly toward the inspector. "I dare say the cook is quite terrified already," she said mildly. "But I should think it rather unlikely she would choose the one evening her mistress was entertaining the village to commit murder. Cooks, in my experience, are far more practical creatures." Crail gave a tight nod. "All the same, no one is above suspicion." At that moment, Lionel Marchmont turned, his voice low but steady. "My wife had no enemies. Whatever happened, it was some dreadful mistake." Beatrice Grey let out a nervous laugh that sounded dangerously close to hysteria. A mistake? My dear Lionel, people don't simply drop dead at the dinner table from mistakes. Someone wanted her gone. Pembroke's teacup rattled against its saucer. Beatrice, for heaven's sake. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes, she said softly, what people call mistakes are merely the unintended results of quite deliberate acts. The words seemed to hover in the air. Pembroke looked away. Beatrice turned pale. Miss Marple appeared not to notice the effect of her remark, instead adjusting her shawl and glancing at the tea service laid out near the sideboard. It was then that she noticed something peculiar, a small silver spoon resting apart from the others, faintly tarnished as though it had been wiped hastily. Her eyes lingered on it only a second before she looked up again. "Inspector," she said gently, "might I trouble you for a word in private?" They stepped into the adjoining hall. Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "I wonder if anyone mentioned whether Lady Marchmont preferred sugar in her tea." Crail blinked. "What an odd question. I believe she did. Pembroke was the one who served it to her last night, I think." "Ah," said Miss Marple, as if that confirmed something small but significant. "And Mr. Pembroke's wife, does she take sugar?" "No, I don't think so." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "I thought as much." She glanced back toward the breakfast room where the others sat in uneasy silence. "It may be nothing, Inspector. Still, you see, people's habits around tea can be so very telling. It's often in the small courtesies, who pours, who serves, who insists on helping, that human nature shows itself most plainly." Crail frowned but made a note in his pad. "You think Pembroke could have—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that it is quite possible for a man to act chivalrously and still have reason to wish someone dead." The inspector looked unconvinced, but he'd learned not to underestimate the quiet old lady from St. Mary Mead. As the day wore on, the investigation deepened. The servants were questioned again, revealing a string of petty resentments. The housemaid, Ellen, confessed that Lady Marchmont had accused her of stealing a brooch the week before. The butler, Graves, admitted he disliked Mr. Pembroke and thought him too familiar with the lady of the house. But Miss Marple's interest remained curiously focused on small, almost domestic matters, the positioning of teacups, the way the place cards had been arranged at dinner, the faint scent of lavender soap on a napkin. Late that afternoon, she wandered quietly into the drawing room and examined the sideboard where the drinks had been served the previous evening. The decanter of sherry stood half empty, beside a glass with a faint ring of lipstick. Miss Marple picked it up delicately, sniffed it, then placed it back. Her expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened with quiet realization. A moment later, Lionel Marchmont entered. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his face drawn. "Miss Marple," he said, "I cannot bear this any longer. Tell me, do you truly believe someone at my table killed her?" She turned slowly to face him. "I believe," she said softly, "that people are rarely what they seem. You may find that the reasons for such things lie not in the grand gestures, but in the small hidden corners of the heart." His jaw tightened. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed kindly, "but perhaps it is the beginning of one." Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the manicured hedges and the winding path leading toward the village. Miss Marple stood by the window, watching as the sun struggled through the mist. Somewhere in her expression, gentle, calm, but entirely unyielding, there was the faintest glimmer of truth forming. She had seen something last night, or perhaps noticed something that hadn't happened, that no one else thought to question. As the clock struck 5, she turned back to the inspector, who had rejoined them, his notepad full of conflicting statements. "Inspector Crail," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might arrange a small gathering this evening. Nothing formal, just a quiet talk among those who were present last night. I think perhaps with a little reflection, one of them may remember something very important indeed." Her tone was calm, almost cheerful, but there was a quiet certainty beneath it. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, not yet in full view, but close enough that Miss Marple could sense the shadow of the truth waiting to emerge. And in that fading afternoon light, as the house settled into uneasy silence once more, it was clear that the most dangerous secrets of Little Briar House were only beginning to surface. Evening descended once more upon Little Briar House, its windows glowing softly against the encroaching dusk. Inside, the drawing room had been arranged with quiet precision. A circle of chairs, tea and scones on the table, and the faint scent of polish still lingering in the air. Inspector Crail stood by the mantel, his posture tense but disciplined, while Miss Marple sat serenely by the hearth, knitting needles in hand, the picture of grandmotherly calm. The guests filtered in one by one, their faces guarded, their eyes avoiding one another's. Mr. Pembroke entered first, impeccably dressed as ever, though his cufflinks were mismatched, a detail Miss Marple noted with gentle curiosity. Behind him came Beatrice Grey, clutching a small handkerchief, though her eyes were quite dry. Lionel Marchmont followed, pale and hollow-eyed, his grief now subdued into quiet composure. Mrs. Pembroke arrived last, her smile brittle, her voice pitched too high as she greeted everyone. Crail cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming." Miss Marple suggested a brief discussion to review the evening's events once more. "She seems to believe that in our recollections something may emerge that we've overlooked." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Oh, I shouldn't put it so grandly, Inspector. It's just that memory, particularly after a shock, tends to reorder itself in the most interesting ways. Sometimes the smallest recollection, an action, a word, a gesture, can alter one's whole understanding of things." Her eyes rested briefly on Mr. Pembroke, who shifted uncomfortably. Lionel gave a weary sigh. "If you think it will help, Miss Marple, I'll do anything to know what really happened." "Thank you, Mr. Marchmont. Then perhaps we might begin," she said gently. "Tell me, do you recall who poured the wine that evening?" Lionel frowned, trying to remember. "I believe I did, at least for the ladies nearest me." Beatrice nodded quickly. "Yes, Lionel poured for me and for your wife, I think. Pembroke was serving himself brandy at the sideboard." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And who poured the tea after dinner?" Mrs. Pembroke spoke up, her tone quick and bright. "Why, that was my husband again. He always insists on it. Says it's a gentleman's duty to serve the ladies." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So he does." She turned her gaze back to the inspector. "And Lady Marchmont's cup was the one with sugar, yes?" "Yes," said Crail, nodding. "2 spoonfuls, according to the servants. Pembroke added them himself. There was a stillness in the room, subtle but unmistakable. The faint ticking of the clock filled the silence. Pembroke's lips tightened. "Surely you're not implying that I—" "Good heavens, Miss Marple, you can't think—" She raised a placid hand. "Oh, not at all. I think only that habits are curious things. You see, I noticed the sugar bowl had been slightly moved when I came in earlier, as though someone had reached for it in haste. And there was that one spoon, tarnished, slightly damp, not quite like the others. Such little things are often quite revealing." Beatrice's fingers trembled around her handkerchief. "What are you saying? That someone tampered with the sugar?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Perhaps, or perhaps with the spoon. A powdered poison, even the smallest pinch, could cling easily to silver. A person who knew which cup Lady Marchmont would use might not need to add anything to the tea itself, only to the spoon she always favored." Crail's eyes widened. "Good Lord. And that would explain the absence of residue in the cup or the sugar bowl." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "It would." Pembroke's face had gone pale. "This is absurd. I had no reason to harm her. We were friends, old friends." "Were you?" Miss Marple asked mildly, her eyes still fixed on her knitting. "I'm told Lady Marchmont was rather fond of your company. Fond enough perhaps to give you certain—" "Confidences?" He stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." "Ah, but others might," Miss Marple continued gently. "It seems Mrs. Pembroke was quite aware of your friendship. It must be trying, I should think, to see one's husband spoken of in whispers, even in a village as discreet as this one." Mrs. Pembroke's face flushed scarlet. "That's nonsense," she cried. "Everyone knew my husband adored me. And if he spent time with that woman, it was purely social." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Of course, my dear. But jealousy is such a mischievous thing. It doesn't always need truth to thrive. I dare say you knew of Lady Marchmont's plans to assist your husband financially with his business venture. Such generosity might have looked compromising. There was a sharp intake of breath. Mrs. Pembroke looked stricken. How could you possibly know that?" "I didn't," Miss Marple said softly. "Not until now." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of silence. Crail took a step forward, his gaze hardening. "Mrs. Pembroke, is this true?" Tears welled in her eyes. "She humiliated me," she whispered. "All of them did." The way she looked at him, The way everyone talked. I just wanted her to stop. I didn't mean... She broke off suddenly, trembling. Miss Marple's expression was compassionate but firm. You only meant to frighten her, perhaps? A pinch of powder from the chemist's, something to make her ill. But you misjudged the measure. It happens. People so often forget how delicate such substances can be. The woman buried her face in her hands. It wasn't supposed to kill her, she sobbed. Just enough to make her sick, to keep her away for a while. Oh God, what have I done? Inspector Crail moved forward swiftly, signaling his constable outside. The door closed with a dull thud. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting motionless in her lap. There was no triumph in her expression, only a kind of weary understanding. It is remarkable, isn't it? She said softly after a moment. How often great tragedies begin with the smallest of intentions. Lionel Marchmont stood frozen, shock hollowing his features. She killed her over jealousy. Not jealousy alone, Miss Marple murmured. Pride, humiliation, fear. Those are very English motives, Mr. Marchmont. Quite respectable in their way. Outside, the night had settled fully now, cloaking the village in stillness. Inside the drawing room, the last of the teacups remained untouched, their surfaces gleaming under the lamplight. Miss Marple gathered her knitting once more, her eyes calm, her manner composed. She had seen too much of human frailty to be surprised, but never enough to stop her from feeling the quiet sadness of it all. And as the inspector led the trembling Mrs. Pembroke away, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the empty chair where Lady Marchmont had once sat, radiant and unknowing. In the soft echo of her voice and laughter, now only memory, lingered the final truth of the matter. In every polite village, beneath every courteous smile, human hearts still carried their secret poisons. The following morning broke with a stillness that seemed almost reverent. A soft drizzle fell over St. Mary Mead, muting the sound of distant carriages and the faint chiming of church bells. Inside Little Briar House, however, that calm was deceptive. The air carried the aftertaste of confession, an uneasy blend of relief and shame. Mrs. Pembroke had been taken away in quiet tears the night before, escorted by Inspector Crail and his constable, leaving behind a household stunned into silence. Miss Marple sat in the morning room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching as a solitary servant removed the tea tray. Her eyes followed the gentle swirl of steam rising from the pot. It's curious, she said softly, almost to herself, how the smallest kindness or unkindness can lead one down such a dreadful road. Lionel Marchmont stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the rain-streaked glass. I cannot forgive her, he said finally, his voice quiet but hard. My wife trusted them both. To think it all came down to gossip and vanity. God, what a waste. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She adjusted her shawl, her movements slow and precise. Forgiveness, Mr. Marchmont, is not always about the other person. Sometimes it's merely the only way to keep from carrying their sin along with your own. He turned to her, surprised. Do you truly believe that? After all this? Her lips curved in the faintest of smiles. My dear, after all I've seen, I believe human beings are infinitely capable of folly, but also of grace if only they learn from what they've done. Sadly, few ever do. At that moment, the door opened and Inspector Crail entered, his boots damp from the walk. He looked older than he had the night before, though his voice remained brisk. Morning, Miss Marple, Mr. Marchmont. We've taken Mrs. Pembroke into custody. She's confessed to acquiring the powder, arsenical compound used for cleaning lace. Says she only meant to cause discomfort. He exhaled, shaking his head. But we'll need to verify everything. There's still one piece that doesn't fit. Miss Marple looked up, interested. Oh, Crail frowned, glancing at his notes. The chemist in Market Down swears he sold her only a small packet, enough to make a cat sick, not kill a person. But the dose found in Lady Marchmont's system was far stronger, 4 times as much. Either she lied about the amount she used, or someone else contributed, Miss Marple finished quietly. Lionel's brow furrowed. Someone else? But I thought it was settled. She admitted everything. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, everything she knew she had done. But guilt, you see, can blind as much as it reveals. It's quite possible she was not the only hand involved. Crail's expression darkened. You think she had an accomplice? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she rose and walked to the writing desk by the window. On it lay a stack of envelopes, correspondence from the previous week neatly tied with a blue ribbon. She picked up one and examined the handwriting. "This," she said, "is Lady Marchmont's hand. Very distinctive loops in the L's and M's. And this," she selected another envelope from the pile, "is Mr. Pembroke's. Notice how similar they are, almost studied in their neatness. Curious, isn't it, how imitation creeps into relationships, first in mannerisms, then in handwriting, and sometimes in moral habits as well." Lionel frowned. "What are you implying?" "That people who are close often mirror one another, even in wrongdoing," she said mildly. "It occurs to me, Inspector, that Mr. Pembroke might not have been as innocent as he appeared. His wife, after all, might never have known the precise strength of what she handled. But a man of his sort, a little too clever, a little too prideful, might easily see a way to turn his wife's jealous gesture into something far more permanent." Creel's jaw tightened. "You think Pembroke meant to ensure Lady Marchmont's death?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that he saw an opportunity. A touch of additional powder, a quick stir while pretending gallantry with the tea. His wife would carry the blame, of course. After all, jealousy makes such a tidy motive." Lionel's face paled. "But that would mean she was used." "My God," Miss Marple sighed. "Yes, used and discarded, as so many foolish women are by the men who pride themselves on charm and intelligence. He likely never believed she would confess so easily. Pride makes very poor judges of conscience." Creel nodded grimly. "He's still in the village. I had a feeling something about his manner didn't sit right. I'll bring him in for questioning." When the inspector had gone, silence returned to the room. Lionel paced before the hearth, his agitation plain. "You read people as if they were books, Miss Marple," he said finally. "But tell me, why do you do it? Doesn't it tire you seeing the worst in everyone?" She smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "Oh, not the worst, Mr. Marchmont, the truth. The worst merely hides inside it. I've found over the years that evil is rarely dramatic. It's often terribly polite." A quiet knock interrupted them. Ellen, the housemaid, peeked in, eyes wide. "Beg pardon, sir," she whispered. "Inspector's just come back. As Mr. Pembroke's gone, left the inn this morning before dawn." Miss Marple's eyes met Lionel's. "How very predictable," she said softly. "Men who commit clever murders always think they can outwit time. But time, dear Mr. Marchmont, has far better memory than any of us." Outside, the rain began to ease, leaving the world glistening and raw. Miss Marple rose, her knitting basket under one arm, and turned toward the door. "Come, I think we had best see what can be done. It wouldn't do to let him slip away entirely. Not when the truth is so very close to being complete." As she stepped into the damp, cold air, her figure small but unwavering, Lionel felt a chill run through him, not from the weather, but from the quiet certainty in her voice. Somewhere beneath her calm exterior, the pattern had already formed, precise and unbreakable, and as the grey morning deepened, the sense of final reckoning grew, a feeling that before the day was done, Miss Marple would unravel the last cruel thread in the tapestry of deceit that had begun with a single poisoned spoon. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned into a fine mist, turning the village lanes into ribbons of silver. Miss Marple, wrapped in her grey shawl, walked with quiet purpose toward the Green Man Inn, her small steps steady and deliberate. Inspector Creel's men had already combed the stables and questioned the porter, but there was still no sign of Mr. Pembroke. His room upstairs, however, had yielded an odd assortment of things: a half-empty flask, a set of cufflinks that didn't match, and a torn scrap of a letter addressed to someone in London. Miss Marple was shown into the sitting room by the innkeeper's wife, who seemed flustered by all the commotion. "It's terrible business, ma'am," she said breathlessly. "Mr. Pembroke paid his bill just before dawn, said he was catching the early train. Didn't seem in a rush, mind you, just quiet, like a man who'd made up his mind about something." Miss Marple nodded gently. "People who make up their minds in haste, my dear, often think it's finality they're choosing. But it's usually just escape." She thanked the woman and ascended the narrow staircase to Pembroke's former room. The scent of tobacco still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with damp wood and the faint tang of cologne. Miss Marple looked around carefully, her eyes sweeping over the neatly made bed, the closed trunk and the writing desk by the window. She approached the desk and examined the blotter. Beneath it lay a few impressions: faint outlines of words written and torn away. She lifted the paper toward the light, squinting to make out the indentations. "Dearest," was all that could be read, followed by a few broken phrases. "Could not risk it. Was never meant. Must disappear before they know." Her expression softened, touched with a trace of melancholy. "Ah," she murmured, "how very human." Moments later, Inspector Crail entered, hat in hand, his expression grim. "He's gone, Miss Marple. Took the train to London by the looks of it. We've sent word ahead, but if he keeps his head, he could be halfway across the country before anyone spots him." Miss Marple looked out of the window at the dripping eaves and the soft grey horizon. "He won't run far, Inspector," she said calmly. Men like Mr. Pembroke rarely do. They believe themselves too clever to be caught, and that belief will draw him back sooner or later. Crail frowned. "Back? Here?" "Oh, yes," she said mildly. "There are loose ends he cannot bear to leave untied. Letters, perhaps, or things that might incriminate him more deeply than he realizes. Pride is such a dangerous companion." Her gaze drifted again to the desk. She lifted a small brass key from the surface and handed it to the inspector. "He's locked something in the trunk, I should think." Crail crouched and turned the key. The lock clicked, and he lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded coat, a travel bag, and beneath them a small wooden box. He opened it cautiously. Within, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, was a glass vial half filled with a pale powder. Crail's jaw tightened. "Good Lord, arsenic." "More of it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I thought as much. You see, Mrs. Pembroke would never have known where to obtain that amount on her own. He must have supplied it, pretending to sympathize with her jealousy while quietly ensuring the dose was lethal. Then, once her confession served its purpose, he thought to vanish before anyone asked too many questions." Crail exhaled slowly. "You were right again, Miss Marple. But why the note? Who's A? Someone in London?" "Most likely another woman," Miss Marple said softly. "There's often another woman when vanity mixes with guilt. My guess is that Mrs. Pembroke was merely the convenient wife, useful for her devotion, and ultimately expendable." The inspector gave a grim nod. "I'll have his description sent along every station line from here to Paddington." Miss Marple gathered her shawl about her shoulders. "Yes, that would be wise. Though I expect in the end, he'll make the mistake of trying to recover something from the Marchmont estate. Perhaps a letter, or a keepsake Lady Marchmont meant to send him. Something that might reveal their relationship more clearly. People seldom think their secrets will outlast them. It was near midnight when word came that a man matching Pembroke's description had been spotted in the churchyard near Little Briar House. Miss Marple insisted on accompanying Inspector Crail, and together they walked the gravel path through the fog. The moon hung low and pale, barely breaking through the mist. Near the gate, a figure crouched by the vicar's wall, fumbling with a small packet. When the beam of Crail's lantern fell upon him, he froze. "Pembroke," the inspector barked. "Stand where you are!" But the man bolted, darting between the tombstones, his footfalls echoing sharply. Crail gave chase, and Miss Marple followed more slowly, her sharp eyes fixed on his path. He tripped near a low stone, the packet scattering across the wet grass, a bundle of letters tied in blue ribbon. Crail seized him, wrenching his arms behind his back. Pembroke struggled weakly, then went still, his face ashen. "You don't understand," he gasped. "It wasn't supposed to end like this. She was going to leave him, she promised me." Miss Marple approached, her expression almost sorrowful. "Lady Marchmont promised you?" she asked quietly. "And when she changed her mind, you decided no one else should have her loyalty. Not her husband and not your wife." Pembroke turned his face away. "She was mine," he whispered hoarsely. "She said she would be. Until she betrayed me." Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost pitying. "So you turned a foolish woman's jealousy into your weapon, and her love into your alibi. How very tidy and how very cruel." He looked up at her then, and for a moment there was something like awe in his eyes. "You see everything, don't you? Every little truth people try to hide." She gave a faint smile. "Not everything, Mr. Pembroke, only enough." Crail hauled him to his feet, the clink of handcuffs loud in the still night. "That'll do," he said roughly. "You'll have your say at the station." As they led him away, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the scattered letters, stooping to pick up one and slip it back into its ribbon. The ink had run, the words blurred. but she could still make out the opening line. "My dearest Charles, I cannot do what you ask." She sighed softly, tucking it away. "Poor souls," she murmured. "They never do see how easily love turns to possession, and possession to destruction." The fog thickened around her as she turned back toward the house, the faint glow of lantern light guiding her path. Tomorrow the village would wake to whispers once again. But for now, all was silent, save for the wind through the trees and the quiet, steady sound of Miss Marple's footsteps on the wet stone. The night passed uneasily in St. Mary Mead. A heavy stillness hung over the village, as though even the wind itself waited for dawn. Miss Marple sat by her fireside, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her thoughts wandered, not in confusion, but in the quiet, orderly way she always approached life. Mr. Pembroke was in custody, yes, but the story felt incomplete, as though a thread remained unpulled. She had seen too much of human frailty to believe in simple conclusions. There was always one last layer, one last motive behind the confessed motive. At 7:30, a knock came at the door. Inspector Crail entered, looking weary but satisfied. "He's been talking," he said, "all night. Says it was an accident, that Lady Marchmont took the poison meant for her husband." Miss Marple glanced up, her voice calm but edged with quiet disbelief. "Ah, yes, an accident. A word that's become quite fashionable in murder cases, I find." Crail frowned. "You think he's lying?" "I think," she replied, "that Mr. Pembroke is telling the truth, at least his own version of it. The kind people tell themselves when they can no longer bear the truth they've created." She rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the faint light rising over the garden. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone spoken to Lady Marchmont's maid since the night of the death?" "Annie Dawes?" "She's still at the Marchmont house. Said she didn't see anything unusual." "Then perhaps we should ask her again," Miss Marple said, taking up her shawl. "Memory is a curious thing, Inspector. It improves considerably when one realizes what others have remembered first." They arrived at the Marchmont estate as the fog began to lift from the lawns. The house felt changed, emptier somehow, as though the very walls were mourning. Annie Dawes, a timid girl with downcast eyes, admitted them to the drawing-room. Miss Marple sat opposite her, voice soft as tea poured into porcelain. "My dear, I expect this has been a dreadful time for you, but you were fond of your mistress, weren't you?" Annie nodded. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Lady Marchmont was kind to me. Always gentle. She didn't deserve what happened." "No, she did not," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, Annie, the night before she died, you brought her evening tea, did you not?" The girl hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." She took it in her room, as usual. Mr. Pembroke was visiting. He'd come in through the garden door. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-loop in her lap. Through the garden door. How very unusual at that hour. "He said the master had gone to London, ma'am, and he'd come to speak with her privately. They quarrelled." I could hear them from the hall. Inspector Crail leaned forward. "Quarrelled about what?" "I don't know, sir. But when I went in after he'd left, her ladyship was crying. She told me to fetch her writing case." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah, yes, the letters. She was writing to someone, wasn't she?" Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I saw her sealing them myself, but she never sent them. Next morning, when I went to bring her breakfast, the desk was empty. The letters were gone." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then we know now what Mr. Pembroke returned for last night. Not guilt, self-preservation. Those letters were her insurance, my dear. She had discovered something dangerous about him, and she intended to reveal it." Inspector Crail straightened. "You think the letters could prove she didn't take the poison herself?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "they may prove she never meant to take it at all." She rose, turning toward the grand staircase. "Let's have a look at her room, shall we? There's one thing I wish to confirm." They climbed the stairs to Lady Marchmont's chambers, where the morning light fell through gauzy curtains. The dressing table gleamed with untouched perfumes, but Miss Marple's eyes moved past them to the writing desk. She pulled open a drawer and withdrew a small porcelain cup, the kind used for sleeping draughts. She sniffed it delicately, then smiled. "Ah," she said softly, "this confirms my suspicion. You see, Inspector, Mrs. Pembroke's confession mentioned a teacup, but Lady Marchmont's poison was not administered that way. It was dissolved in this little cup. Someone swapped the vessels after she was found." Crail blinked. "Then the confession—" Was stage-managed, Miss Marple finished. Mr. Pembroke ensured his wife would believe herself guilty, when in truth she was merely his scapegoat. He must have switched the cups before calling for help. By the time anyone noticed, the evidence had conveniently changed hands. Annie gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. Then she, Lady Marchmont, didn't mean to die. No, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. She meant to live and to expose him. She turned toward Crail, her expression grave. He wanted both women silenced, his lover who might betray him, and his wife whose guilt would protect him. When one death covered both crimes, he saw his path clear. Crail exhaled, his shoulders tense. He'll hang for it then. Miss Marple's tone was calm, almost weary. Justice will take its course, as it always does. But it never feels quite the same as peace, does it? She moved to the window and looked down over the gardens, where autumn leaves lay thick across the path. Here's the smallest things, Inspector. The placement of a cup, the scent of arsenic on a handkerchief, the tone in a frightened girl's voice, that tell us what really happened. Evil never hides as cleverly as it believes it does. Crail watched her for a moment, then gave a low, respectful nod. You've done it again, Miss Marple. I don't know how you see it all, she smiled faintly. Oh, I don't see everything. But people are very much alike, Inspector. Once you've watched enough of them, their little dramas begin to repeat themselves, different names, same tragedies. As they descended the stairs, Annie Dawes whispered, Will you stay, ma'am? Until it's all finished? Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. No, my dear. I think it's finished enough. There's nothing more to be gained by looking backward. The living must tidy up after the dead. It's the only kindness we can offer them. Outside the sky had cleared, pale sunlight spilling over the wet lawns. The air smelled of earth and roses. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer around her shoulders and began the quiet walk home, her mind already turning toward her garden and the kettle waiting on her stove. She paused once at the gate, glancing back at the Marchmont house, silhouetted against the morning. So many secrets, she murmured, and all for love or what people mistake for it. Then, with a soft sigh, she continued down the lane, her figure small but resolute against the mist, fading gently into the peace of St. Mary Mead. The morning after the confession, St. Mary Mead seemed to return to its familiar, placid rhythm, at least on the surface. The milkman clattered down the lane, children passed the churchyard on their way to school, and the faint hum of conversation filled the air like bees around late roses. Yet beneath that calm, the story of the Marchmont murder lingered in every whispered exchange and knowing glance. Lady Marchmont's death had shaken the village, not merely because it was tragic, but because it had revealed something far less comfortable, the ease with which evil could hide behind charm and good breeding. Miss Marple sat in her little sitting room, a cup of tea steaming gently beside her as the fire crackled low. Her housekeeper, Miss Knight, bustled in, clearly bursting with the latest gossip. Well, they've taken Mr. Pembroke up to London this morning, Miss Marple. The inspector himself escorted him. They say he didn't say a word the whole way, pale as chalk he was. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Silence is often the first sign of understanding, my dear. He's had the whole night to realize what he's lost. Not just freedom, but illusion. A very painful thing, losing one's illusions. Miss Knight gave a sympathetic cluck. I never thought him capable of such a thing. Always so polite, and that smile of his. Well, you'd never guess there was poison behind it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is rather the way with poisoners. One rarely expects them to scowl and bare their teeth. Their weapons are subtler, and their disguises charming. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Inspector Crail, looking far more relaxed than Miss Marple had yet seen him. Good morning, Miss Marple. I owe you my thanks again. You've saved us from a very tidy miscarriage of justice. She waved a hand modestly. Oh, I'm sure you'd have found it eventually, Inspector. Though perhaps not before poor Mrs. Pembroke found herself in the dock. Crail smiled ruefully. You're too generous. The man fooled us all. That performance of his last night, well, I nearly believed he'd repented. You were right about the letters. We found them tucked behind the false panel in the writing desk. Lady Marchmont had written 3, one to her solicitor, one to her cousin in London, and one to a lady friend in Bath. Each hinted she'd discovered her husband's financial deception and intended to expose him quietly. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. People so rarely wish to cause scandal, Inspector. They think they can keep decency intact, even while uncovering indecency. It's a dangerous kind of politeness. Crail sat down opposite her, studying the old woman with the wary admiration he had come to feel. "Tell me something, Miss Marple. What gave him away to you truly? Was it the letters, the cups, or something else entirely?" Her blue eyes twinkled. "It was nothing so tangible, Inspector. You see, men like Mr. Pembroke always believe themselves exceptional. Yet their behavior follows the same old pattern. I once knew a gardener who pretended to love his wife while slowly starving her roses out of spite. He couldn't bear them to bloom without his tending. Mr. Pembroke reminded me of that gardener. Always smiling, always attentive, but there was something possessive about his politeness. I dare say Lady Marchmont saw it too once it was too late." Crail nodded slowly. "You always find the human pattern first, don't you? Not the fingerprints, not the evidence, just the heart of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "People, Inspector, are far less mysterious than they imagine. Their motives rarely change: love, jealousy, greed, pride. The methods evolve, but the hearts remain quite the same." A silence settled between them, companionable yet heavy with unspoken reflection. Then Crail rose, adjusting his coat. "Well, I suppose I'll be off. Paperwork doesn't solve itself. Though I'll say this, Miss Marple. You make the police look slow, but you make the world make sense again. That's rarer than you think." She smiled gently. "Oh, I shouldn't like to make it make sense, Inspector. Only to make it a little clearer." When he had gone, Miss Marple turned back to her knitting, though her thoughts were far away. The rhythm of the needles matched the steady tick of the clock. She thought of Lady Marchmont, her delicate hands folded over her chest as they'd found her, of Mrs. Pembroke, weeping behind the bars of her husband's lies, and of Annie Dawes, the frightened maid whose small courage had unlocked the truth. So many lives intersecting in that one fatal evening, each playing a part, knowingly or not, in the grand performance of deceit. That evening, the vicar called with his wife, Mrs. Clement, who was never far behind any village drama. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement exclaimed as soon as the tea was poured, "how dreadful it all is. The newspapers are calling it 'The Dinner Served for the Dead,' such a ghastly title, but so very apt. However do you manage to bear all these tragedies, when you always seem to be in the middle of them?" Miss Marple smiled with a kind of weary kindness. "Oh, I don't bear them, my dear. I simply observe them. Human nature, after all, doesn't change. It merely dresses itself in new clothes." The vicar chuckled softly. "You make it sound rather biblical, Miss Marple." "Perhaps it is," she replied, eyes glinting. "Pride and deceit have been with us since Eve plucked the apple, have they not?" Mrs. Clement sighed. "Well, I do hope things settle down again. It's been such a strain, all this suspicion and scandal. The Marchmont's house will stand empty for a long while, I think." "I imagine it will," Miss Marple murmured. "Houses, like people, sometimes need time to recover from wickedness." When her guests had gone and the quiet of evening crept once more around her cottage, Miss Marple rose and drew the curtains. The last light of dusk glowed through the lace. Somewhere in the distance the church bell tolled softly, marking another day's end. She stood for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the window frame, watching the faint lamplight flicker in the neighboring houses. Behind each one, she thought, lay its own collection of secrets, small cruelties, quiet kindnesses, ambitions, regrets. A lifetime of patterns waiting to be read. And yet, as always, there was comfort too. The kettle on the stove, the rustle of knitting wool, the familiar hum of ordinary life returning after storm. Evil had passed, but life endured. With a small sigh and the faintest smile, Miss Marple turned back toward her chair. "Now then," she said to herself softly, "I believe the dahlias will need cutting tomorrow." The fire crackled gently as she settled into her seat, her needles beginning their quiet rhythmic dance once more. Outside, the world carried on unchanged, and yet somehow a little wiser for her watching. Several weeks had passed since the Marchmont affair, and the village of St. Mary Mead, with its ivy-covered cottages and polite gossip, seemed once more wrapped in the comfort of routine. Yet for those with eyes to see, a faint residue of unease lingered, a tremor beneath the calm surface of daily life. Evil, Miss Marple often mused, was rather like mildew. Even after you've scrubbed it away, some trace remains, hidden and waiting for the right dampness to grow again. Miss Marple's mornings had resumed their quiet order. The kettle whistled promptly at 8:30. The postman nodded at her gate. and she spent her hours pruning the dahlias that grew in defiance of the season. But every so often, she caught herself glancing toward the Marchmont estate through the thin fog that rose beyond the churchyard. Its windows were shuttered now, its gardens neglected, the once proud house slowly surrendering to silence. She felt, not pity exactly, but a certain melancholy for it, a home undone not by poverty or decay, but by human vanity. One afternoon, as she returned from the grocer's with her basket, she found a young woman waiting at her garden gate. The girl was neat but pale, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Miss Marple recognized her at once, Annie Dawes, Lady Marchmont's former maid. "Good afternoon, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "You look as though you've come with something on your mind. Do come in. There's tea just brewed." Inside, Annie perched on the edge of the floral armchair, her gaze darting toward the door as though half afraid of being overheard. "I didn't know where else to go, Miss Marple. You were so kind before, and, well, I thought you ought to know something. About that night." Miss Marple set down the teapot carefully. "Something new, my dear?" Annie nodded, swallowing hard. "It's about Lady Marchmont's jewelry. The emerald pendant. She always wore it to dinner, but that night it was missing. I didn't think much of it then, what with everything that happened, but I found out yesterday it's turned up in a pawnbroker's shop in Melchester. The police say it must have been stolen long before her death." Miss Marple's eyes, mild and blue, sharpened slightly. "How curious. Mr. Pembroke was already spending beyond his means, was he not? But theft before murder. No, that doesn't quite fit." She poured the girl another cup of tea, her tone gentle but probing. "Who, I wonder, would have known enough about her habits to take it, and to sell it without fear of being traced?" Annie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the cup. "There's one person, ma'am, Mr. Collins, the butler. He left soon after, well, after everything happened. Said he couldn't bear the house anymore. But I heard from a cousin in Melchester that he's been living quite well lately. Too well for a man with no savings." Miss Marple gave a soft hum of thought, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Collins, yes. I remember him. A man of rigid manners but somewhat elastic morality. It would seem, Annie, that our little tale has not yet been told in full." That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short letter to Inspector Crail, inviting him to tea the next morning. When he arrived, still half amused and half resigned to her summons, she wasted no time. "It appears, Inspector, that our butler may have played a rather more interesting role than we gave him credit for." Crail frowned, taking the note she offered. "The emerald pendant, eh? We assumed it had been pawned by Pembroke to pay his debts, which would be convenient," Miss Marple replied mildly, "if one wanted to close a case neatly. But thieves and murderers, Inspector, are seldom tidy. The butler's departure so soon after the incident, his sudden prosperity, these are not coincidences. He may not have killed Lady Marchmont, but I suspect he played a hand in her undoing." Crail sighed. "You think he was blackmailing her?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "Not her, Inspector, Mr. Pembroke. Collins would have known everything. Their quarrels, their meetings, even the letter-writing. A clever servant sees more than he should, and values his silence accordingly. But perhaps when Pembroke refused to pay any longer, Collins found a way to remind him of the danger he posed. Which could mean," Crail said slowly, "that Pembroke's motive wasn't just financial or romantic. He might have killed to silence Collins as well." "Precisely. Or perhaps," Miss Marple added softly, "he believed that killing Lady Marchmont would destroy the only leverage Collins possessed. In that he was wrong, but it makes his haste to confess all the more understandable. The guilty often rush to control the story before someone else tells it for them." The inspector rose, already halfway to the door. "I'll send a man to Melchester. If Collins sold the pendant, he may have more to say." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Do that, Inspector. And while you're there, ask the pawnbroker one small question. Was the pendant sold before or after Lady Marchmont's death? That will tell us who was truly desperate." 2 days later, a telegram arrived. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling under her fingers. It read, "Pendant sold 2 days after murder. Collins in custody, confessed to blackmail, but denies involvement in poisoning. Claims Pembroke promised payment to keep silent, then framed him for theft, all as you said." "Crail, Miss." Marple read the words with quiet satisfaction, then folded the telegram neatly beside her teacup. Justice, she reflected, was never swift and rarely simple. It moved instead like ivy, slowly, patiently, winding its way through the cracks of lies until it reached the light. That evening, as the sky deepened to violet, she stepped out into her garden. The air was crisp, scented faintly with damp earth and wood smoke. In the distance, the bells of St. Mary Mead chimed the hour. She paused among the dahlias, touching one delicate bloom with the tip of her finger. "So much vanity, even in flowers," she murmured with a gentle smile. "Always reaching for beauty, even when the season is done." Behind her, the cottage windows glowed warm against the darkening world. Tomorrow, she thought, there would be new gossip at the vicarage, new tales spun over teacups. But for tonight, all was as it should be. The wicked punished, the innocent vindicated, and life quietly resuming its steady hum. Still, as she turned back toward her door, Miss Marple felt the faint echo of an old truth stirring in her heart. The world was never entirely safe, nor ever entirely lost. People, for all their folly, always revealed themselves in time, and she, with her patient eyes and gentle ways, would always be there to notice. Even with Collins in custody, the air in St. Mary Mead felt curiously unsettled, as though the village itself were holding its breath. News of his arrest spread quickly, and while most were content to see justice served, Miss Marple felt a nagging disquiet she could not quite name. She had learned long ago that true endings were rarely as neat as telegrams made them seem. When human hearts were involved, there were always threads left untied, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. That evening, as dusk softened the sky into a watercolor wash of pink and ash, Miss Marple sat by the fire rereading Collins's statement in the Melchester Gazette. The man had confessed to stealing the emerald pendant, to pawning it, and to blackmailing Mr. Pembroke, but not to murder. He insisted he had seen Pembroke slip something into Lady Marchmont's glass the night she died, claiming that the young man had begged him to stay silent in exchange for money. Yet something in the rhythm of his words troubled Miss Marple. It was too precise, too polished, as though rehearsed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Opening the door, she found Inspector Crail standing on the step, hat in hand and face drawn with fatigue. "Evening, Miss Marple. Thought I'd bring you the full report before it hits the papers. Pembroke's appeal was denied this morning. Case is officially closed." "Is it, Inspector?" she asked quietly, motioning for him to sit. "Forgive me, but I'm not entirely convinced we've untangled every knot." Crail frowned, settling uneasily into his chair. "You think Collins did more than he admits?" "Perhaps less," she said thoughtfully. "There's a peculiar quality to truth, Inspector. It rarely aligns so tidily with self-preservation. Collins's confession gives everyone what they want. The police their culprit, society its scandal neatly packaged, and Pembroke a villain's end. But if Collins truly witnessed Pembroke poison Lady Marchmont, why pawn the pendant after her death? Wouldn't he have fled or hidden? Instead, he stayed until the inquest, then left only when the gossip turned too sharp. That's not the behavior of a man burdened by guilt. It's the behavior of one who feels suddenly unsafe." Crail rubbed his chin. "You think someone else threatened him?" "Someone," she murmured, "with far more to lose than a servant or a penniless suitor." The inspector looked at her shrewdly. "You mean Lady Marchmont herself?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh no, poor woman. She was clever but vain. Her secrets were petty, not perilous. But consider this. Who else lived under that roof, privy to every whisper, every quarrel, every letter exchanged? Someone whose reputation depended entirely on the illusion of respectability." Crail blinked. "You mean Mrs. Ellery, the companion?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Just so. A woman dismissed as insignificant because she blended so perfectly into the background. I recall her at the inquest, too calm, too composed. She spoke of loyalty, yet her accounts of the evening contradicted the cooks and the maids in small, subtle ways. At the time, it seemed trivial. Now I'm not so sure." Crail straightened, the weight of her words settling. "If what you're implying is true, Collins might have taken the fall for someone else. But why would he protect her?" "Because, Inspector," Miss Marple replied softly, "fear takes many forms. Sometimes it's fear of prison. Sometimes it's fear of love betrayed. I suspect Collins and Mrs. Ellery shared more than professional confidence. A bond, perhaps, or a secret understanding. If she poisoned Lady Marchmont to stop her from discovering their scheme, or from exposing something deeper, Collins might have confessed to a lesser crime simply to shield her. Crail stared at the fire, his jaw tightening. We could question her again. But without new evidence. Evidence, Miss Marple said mildly, is often a matter of perspective. Tell me, Inspector, when Lady Marchmont's tea set was examined, was the poison found only in her cup? Yes, traces of arsenic, clear enough. Then it wasn't in the teapot itself, she said quietly, which means someone dosed her cup after the tea was poured. Mrs. Ellery, as companion, was the one who always prepared her lady's tray. It would have been the simplest thing in the world. Crail rose abruptly, determination rekindled in his eyes. I'll bring her in tonight. If she's as clever as you say, she'll know we're closing in. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Be gentle with her, Inspector. The truth, when cornered, often bites. The next morning brought fog thick as muslin over the village, muffling the sound of hooves and voices. By noon, word reached Miss Marple that Mrs. Ellery had confessed, partially reluctantly, but enough. She had poisoned Lady Marchmont to prevent her from revealing that Collins had been embezzling household funds with her help. When Pembroke discovered the theft, he confronted Lady Marchmont, and in the chaos that followed, Mrs. Ellery acted out of panic, slipping poison into the cup during the commotion. Miss Marple listened to the report with quiet composure. Human folly, she reflected, was endlessly inventive. Greed and pride made strange partners. She thanked the messenger, then sat alone for a long time, staring into the low flicker of the fire. Outside, the church bells tolled softly through the fog, each note fading into the stillness. The village would speak of the Marchmont case for years, she knew, shaping and reshaping it with every retelling, until truth became only one version among many. Yet in her heart, Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction that comes not from triumph, but from understanding, the kind of understanding that sees the small, ordinary seeds from which tragedy grows. She folded her hands and whispered to the empty room, "It is a mercy, after all, that people so seldom think deeply. If they did, we'd have far fewer murders and far less for me to do." The fire gave a soft crackle, the sound of closure, and the old clock ticked on. Justice, imperfect though it always was, had found its mark once more in St. Mary Mead.